In this presentation, we're going to move on to community ecology. Okay, so we've done populations in general, and now we're going to start looking at how populations interact with one another, right? That's what a community is. All right, so to begin with, let's talk about population cycling. I know this is kind of a bridge topic between populations and relationships. So one of the relationships is a predator-prey relationship, right? So I don't think I need to define that to you, right? I think you're probably pretty good with what a predator is and what prey are. But what you need to remember is that predators and prey depend on one another. It's really easy to see how the predator depends upon the prey species, right? That's how it gets its food. But don't forget that the prey depends on the predator in order to do some culling to try to keep population sizes in check. Removing the weak and the sick individuals kind of helps with that. Okay. It's important to keep that in mind. And as a result of this, what you see is graphs of the population that kind of mimic one another. This is the hare lynx population on, I can't remember where this took place, but this is just looking over the course of about 50 years to what happened to both the hare and the lynx populations. And let me just switch this here. What you can see is this line here is the hare line, right? And I want you to notice that for the most part, the hare stays well above, you do have these moments, but the hare will stay above the lynx line, ideally most of the time, right? But notice what happens is, first of all, the hare population begins to rise. Notice just a half step later, so does its predator, the lynx. And then when the hare population experiences a big decline, of course, the lynx population is going to experience a crash as a result of that, right? Because its food supply is dipping, right? But then as the hare rebounds just after that, so does the predator. So notice the predator line kind of responds to the prey population in this graph, and it happens the whole way through the graph, as you can see. But notice that the predator population never gets above the prey line, right? And we're going to get into why that is here in this video with trophic relationships. All right, so two terms that are really important, habitat, niche, right? Habitat, I don't think I need to explain to you. Niche might need some reminding, right? This is the role within that the organism plays within the environment. And a niche is kind of an all-encompassing thing. It includes where they live, what resources they use, all the interactions they have with all other organisms, and so on. And that's a really easy concept to understand, but then you need to start thinking about, okay, well, what happens when there's niche overlap, right? What if there's a part of my niche that's very similar to that of another species, and we're both trying to occupy our own niches, but a part of that overlaps and we need the same resource, right? So there is something called Gause's principle. Gause actually did a study using paramecium, and I'll show that to you in just a minute. But essentially, he came up with this idea of competitive exclusion. When two species try to occupy a niche, there will be competition until one species leaves or dies. So let's look at that. Okay, so this is competitive exclusion, and this is what Gause noted. He grew Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum in the same culture, and what he found was that as the Paramecium aurelia population increased, the caudatum population decreased. Okay, so basically Paramecium aurelia outcompeted Paramecium caudatum, and therefore caudatum died out, aurelia thrived, right? And that was because of competitive exclusion. Here's the thing, though, we don't always get competitive exclusion. Sometimes you can get coexistence because the organisms occupy slightly different niches using resources in different ways. So they might be in the same tree, for example, but they might be using the tree differently in such a way that it doesn't conflict with the use of the other organism. That's called resource partitioning. Okay, whoops, sorry. So resource partitioning, that's what you see here, is what happens when that goes on. Okay, I'm going to go back to my pen here. All right, so resource partitioning is one thing that can happen. You can also have character displacement, and I don't know why it's called that. I always think of it as niche shift. That makes more sense to me. Essentially, as a result of resource partitioning, certain species or certain characteristics allow organisms to be able to use their resources more successfully, whatever it was that they were using. Okay, so essentially, you're taking a resource like that tree that we were talking about, right? And two organisms are sharing the tree. Maybe they're splitting it up. I'm going to use, I would like to have the whole tree to myself, but I can't. So you guys take this part of the tree. I'm going to take this part of the tree, right? You've partitioned the resource. You've separated it. But come to find out that this species at the bottom actually finds that they're more successful by using more of the same kind of tree, but only using the bottom of the tree for whatever reason. And that allows them to be more successful, right? And as a result, the niche actually shifts. So their niche used to be whole tree. It used to have involve the whole tree, but now it only involves the bottom of the tree. That's what we call niche shift. And then the realized niche is the niche that the organism occupies because of partitioning. Okay. If there were no competitors, they would occupy what's called the fundamental niche, right? But because of the niche overlap, they have to adjust. So when do we get competitive exclusion and when do we not, right? Okay, and that's really where we have to go here. All right. Oh, and by the way, this is just kind of summarizing all the ways that competition occurs, right? When you have overlapping niches, that's when competition is going to occur. So you've got consumptive competition, where you get these trees trying to put their roots all over one another's roots to get all the water and soil resources. Space is preempted here by these barnacles. Overgrowth is what you'll see in plants, where they put their leaves over a different plant and therefore block sunlight from the plant. Chemical competition, these salvia shrubs will put poisons out into the soil to kill little seedlings. Territorial competition, we talked about that with behavior, and then encounter competition, where you might actually get fighting in these last two times. All right, so this is competitive exclusion, right? The difference, remember I asked, there's this fundamental question: at what point do we have competitive exclusion, and at what point do we instead partition niches? It has to do with the symmetry of the competitors. In other words, are the competitors both equal competitors, or is one a way better competitor than the other, right? And in the case where you get asymmetric competition, right, where this competitor, this is our Paramecium aurelia, it's just way better at it's got a higher fitness. It's better at accessing its resources. Its adaptations are better for that environment. It is much better at competing than the Paramecium caudatum, and so the Paramecium caudatum would die out. So when you have asymmetric competition, you have competitive exclusion. When, however, both competitors are equal, then what they tend to do is partition their niches. Okay, then they'll compete and compete and compete, but neither one is going to win the competition. So what you'll see is partitioning. Okay, now how much you partition, again, it also has to do with niche overlap, right? Excuse me. When niches overlap completely, that's when you start to see strong versus weak competitors as well, right? But when competition is asymmetric and you only have a partial niche overlap, just that area, right? Then what happens is, if you have a slightly weaker competitor, right, they'll stop using this portion of the resource that's here. And partition. Okay, this other competitor may not. Again, if they're equal in competing, then both of these might partition their niche and share the resource. Okay, but again, here this graph also shows you the difference between the fundamental niche, right? This is what the Paramecium caudatum would like to do if given the opportunity and no competitors, and the realized niche would be this is what it looks like after it's partitioned its resources. All right, so here you've got partial niche overlap, right? Okay, this is where you would see partitioning occurring, is in that overlapping region. All right, so let's get on now to the big one. Now that we've covered what a niche, what a habitat is, we've covered that competitive relationship, and we've looked at population cycles. The big idea here in this part, the biggest, most important kind of relationship that you're going to see in a community is the trophic relationship, right? You're going to see food chains, food webs, right? So troph means feed. These are the feeding relationships within an ecosystem. Remember that there's an inefficient energy transfer. Okay, so when you eat your food, you actually are only able to harvest about 10% of its energy as energy to do work within your body. Okay, the other 90% is usually used to build the waste products, right? Because you're talking about biochemical processes where you're breaking chemical bonds to make new ones. And some of the time when you make those new ones, you store energy in those chemical bonds for like ATP, right? So that's essentially what you're doing with cellular respiration, right? But then some of the energy when those chemical bonds are broken is actually not captured and made into new chemical bonds. It's released as heat to the environment. Some of it is captured in new chemical bonds, but they're chemical bonds in the waste products, right? Because you've got to deal with the waste products and get rid of them. So that's going to take away some of the energy as well. The majority of it by far is body heat. So only 10% gets harvested and passed to each trophic level, okay? So you get a reduction in the amount of energy as you move up the food chain. Which is why you can't have a top predator like that lynx that we were looking at in the population cycles graph. You can't have that population ever rise above its prey population, or it destabilizes the food chain, right? That's why the lynx population dropped after that. And even when it peaked, the peak of lynx population never got higher than that of the peak of the hare. All right, so a food chain, remember, is a linear feeding relationship from producer to whatever the end of that chain is. In general, you go from a primary producer to a primary consumer that we call an herbivore, right? A secondary consumer that we call a carnivore, a tertiary consumer, which we call a top carnivore, and then sometimes you have these, or often you have detritovores or decomposers that will break down everything in that food chain, right? Food webs are a bunch of overlapping food chains, right? Okay, so remember that the external energy sources is for the planet is the sun, but the producers synthesize the energy for the food chain through photosynthesis. The consumers don't make energy, but they do consume and pass energy, and decomposers are going to re-release the chemical nutrients back to the environment. Brings me to another point. Remember, matter cycles, right? So really in food chains and food webs, you've got two issues. You've got the energy that's being passed. That flows, right? But because the transfer is inefficient, it decreases as it flows. Not that we've lost the energy, but we've lost it from the organisms themselves. It's lost to the system. Like I said, body heat, right? So it's converted to a form that's no longer usable, right? We can't break that law of conservation of energy. That still exists. So we don't destroy energy, but we do release it in such a way that it's now no longer available to us for work inside of the body. But you also have the issue of the matter in the food supply, right? You have the molecules, the atoms that made up whatever that food was, And as those get broken apart, they usually get assembled into waste products, right? But like I said, when an organism dies, it's still got a lot of matter inside of it. And the role of the decomposer here is to break apart that matter and re-release it back into the environment so that the matter can cycle back through. So, nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, phosphorus cycle, that's what we're talking about here, right? Those things that cycle matter through the ecosystem. All right, so here are food chains, and there are different kinds of food chains, right? This is a longer food chain. This is a shorter food chain, okay? We rarely see more than 5 trophic levels in the chain. But the trophic level is what you're seeing here. Primary producer, primary decomposer or consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer. If I take these food chains and I overlap them with other food chains, then we get a food web. You still have trophic levels, right? Here's our trophic levels. But now you've got a much more complicated set of relationships, right? But again, notice as you pass the energy from the producers to the primary consumers and so on, the energy release is reduced. As a result of that, what you're going to see is you can't have large populations at the top, right? Because there's not enough energy at the levels below them to support them. So these pyramids that you see, this is an ecological pyramid in front of you. Excuse me. These pyramids, because of the energy loss, the energy reduction, you're also going to see population numbers lessen as you move up the food chain. So the populations get smaller, but also so does the biomass of that particular trophic level goes down as a result. Okay, so you lose energy as you move up the food chain, you lose population size, or not lose population size, but you reduce population size, and you see a reduction in biomass as well. All right, let's take a minute and talk about primary productivity for just a quick second together. Primary productivity is the amount of light energy that's converted into chemical energy in an ecosystem, okay, done by the primary producers in our food chains. The gross primary productivity is the total primary productivity, but here's the thing. You can't forget that the producers that are producing oxygen, right, for the environment, they're producing energy, but then they're also producing oxygen, right? So you can either measure the energy, you can measure the oxygen. We usually measure the oxygen because that's the thing that we can measure, right? Those organisms not only make their own food, but then they also consume their own food. Now, in general, producers produce so much energy that they don't need it all, which is why food chains work, which is why energy can pass through the food chain. So the net productivity is the gross productivity minus the energy that's used by the producers for cellular respiration to generate ATP for themselves, right? Okay, so the formula for net primary productivity is net primary productivity equals the gross primary productivity minus respiration. So that's an important calculation. I know you've dealt with that in apes, but if you haven't had apes, that's what we're talking about. This used to be a lot bigger in the College Board curriculum. It's greatly reduced now, but it's worth mentioning. Okay, so this is just looking at comparing productivity in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Look at algal beds and reefs are some of the most productive ecosystems. They're also some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet, as well as tropical wet forests and so on. Here's the open ocean as well. In terms of area and net productivity. All right. So finally, let's talk about the types of predator-prey relationships that we have and how we avoid predation. This may seem weird, like, what do you mean type of predator? Predator is just anything that kills other things. Well, true, but there are categories of predators. A true predator is what we usually think of. This is the one that kills and eats another animal. Lions come to mind, right? Lions on the savannah, they go after antelopes and zebras, they kill them, they eat them, boom, predator, right? Don't forget that parasites can be predatory if they kill their host. They typically feed off of either part of their host or they feed off of the food that the host brings in. So the ideal parasites don't actually kill their host. They just live off their host, because if they kill their host, then they have to go find another host. You also have parasitoid organisms. These are insects that lay eggs on a host. And then the larvae, during that stage, they're parasitic. During the adults part of the life cycle, they're not. And then you also have herbivores. This one always cracks me up because I can't imagine like a cow stalking the grass, trying to hunt the grass. So even though they don't actually have to go out and hunt the prey that they're eating, that's technically a predator-prey relationship. And there are also different kinds of herbivores. There are granivores that eat seeds, grazers like our cows that eat grasses, and then some eat other plant material, and we call those browsers. All right, so how do we avoid predation? How does an organism avoid its role in the food chain, basically? They have lots of mechanisms for avoiding predation. Plants like to produce secondary compounds, and actually a lot of reptiles and amphibians do this too. They produce a poison, basically. A secondary compound is a compound that's not produced for the benefit of the organism's metabolism necessarily, but it's produced for another reason, right? So these are usually toxic chemicals produced by plants. But like I said, you can also get like amphibians that might produce a toxin in their slime, or reptiles that produce venom and things like that, right? Although venom obviously is a little different, and that's usually used for predation more than anything else. Okay, but these things may not kill the herbivore, these secondary compounds, but they certainly can make the herbivore feel very sick. Okay, camouflage, easy, right? We all know about camouflage. The technical name for camouflage is cryptic coloration, but don't forget the predators also use camouflage. Okay, so while the prey use camouflage to avoid predation, predators use camouflage to avoid being seen so that they can get close enough to get to their prey. You also have aposematic coloration, which is warning coloration. It's why you have small, stripy, stingy things all resembling one another, right? It's an advertisement. It's as opposed camouflage is for blending in, for hiding, for minimizing the appearance. Aposematic coloration is an advertisement. It's for being flashy on purpose to say, leave me alone, I'm bad news, you don't want any part of this, right? So they're kind of different, they're opposites in that way. And then you also have mimicry, right? You can have Mullerian mimicry where, you've got hornets and yellow jackets and different kinds of bees that all look like one another, and they all have stingers, and the stingers have venom, and they're all dangerous, right? And I mentioned that in the behavior video that kind of shortens a predator's learning curve. There is also, however, Batesian mimicry, where you have organisms that are not dangerous, but they resemble dangerous animals as a fake out, right? So those are some examples there. So here are beavers are problematic organisms for trees, right? So when they look at trees that have been cut and resprouted, right, from where beavers cut the trees down and the trees had to resprout, and they compare those to just trees that had not been touched. What they found is that the cut and resprouted trees produce, as a result, more defense compounds, right? Okay, so there's an example of that. Here is looking at blue mussels and prey defense, right? The mussels produce a greater attachment strength and a greater shell thickness in areas where there are more blue crabs that prey upon them. In areas where there's less or fewer blue crabs, lower predation. They don't hold themselves into place quite as much, and they don't produce as thick of a shell. So there's another defense, right? And here's camouflage, right? Here's schooling and shoaling, where animals will, like fish, will move in groups all together because there's safety in numbers, right? A predator might pick off one or two from the edge, but not all of them, right? Because they're all together. And then you've also got weaponry. Here are porcupines, right? That lion's making an attempt, and it's not a wise move, right? And here are the mimics, right? So here are the Mullerian mimics, and here are the Batesian mimics. The Batesian ones are the ones that are not actually dangerous, that don't have stingers, but they resemble the small, stingy, stripy things, right?